Okay, good morning, everybody. I have all of you muted. I think that's going to be the best way to do this. So as we go forward, number one, if you guys have recommendations on how to do this better, please let me know. This is my first kind of big Zoom session, so expect some operator error. And also the chat room we can use essentially to raise your hand. You can either give me messages there, or you can basically raise your hand, say unmute me, or I've got something to say and I'll unmute you and we can discuss. Hope everybody's well. Hope everybody's staying inside. Hope everybody's not taking chances with the lives of people like me. Looking at my notes. A couple of things to introduce. We're obviously going to be talking about Citizen Kane. This movie kind of comes with an albatross around its neck. It's really not fair to any movie to sort of label it as the greatest movie ever made, which unfortunately this movie has been labeled that numerous times. Nothing can really live up to that. Not to mention the fact that we don't try to decide what the greatest painting of all time is, right? We don't try to figure out whether a painting by Monet or a painting by Van Gogh or a painting by Picasso or a painting by Rembrandt or a painting by Norman Rockwell is the greatest painting of all time. We don't try to figure out what the greatest piece of music of all time is. We don't try to figure out what the greatest novel of all time is. This is partially, I think, because of the relative youth, the newness of this particular medium. It's also because of the sort of commercial nature of the medium. But it's one of those things that I like to say, let's see if we can take that off the table. Because there's really no way that this movie can live up to that reputation. What we can leave on the table is, why is this movie so important? Why is it considered to be so important in cinema history? One of the reasons I had you guys watch Casablanca, and watch it before this, even though it's a year after Citizen Kane, is to give you a really good example of what a standard studio, a really, really good, well-made standard studio film of this period would be like. Kind of get you accustomed to seeing that invisible technique, where the filmmakers kind of try to hide themselves and immerse you in the story and the characters and kind of take your appreciation, your consciousness of the technique kind of off the table, which is obviously not what these filmmakers are doing. These filmmakers are doing something completely different, and really going for it. The one other thing I wanted to mention to everybody, and this may be a personal thing. There is a movie out there, and it is an interesting film, about the making of Citizen Kane, called RKO 280, which was kind of the designation within RKO Studios, sort of really the accounting designation of Citizen Kane. It's an interesting movie, but it is absolutely fraught with inaccuracies. There's almost nothing about it that's accurate. So I kind of like to warn students, if they stumble across that movie, to take that with a grain of salt. Okay, let's do what we normally do. Let me throw it to you guys out there. And thank you, Chase. I'm doing my best. Let's just kind of throw it out there and see where do you guys want to go? What do you want to talk about in terms of Citizen Kane today? And who wants to talk? Nate. Okay, let me figure out how to. Now this is where I may be struggling just a little bit. Let me find you. Oh, we got some people waiting to get in, so let me admit them. Hold on, Nate. I'm looking for you. Okay. Oh golly, which Nate are you, Nate? It's just okay. Got it. All right. Okay. Nate, can we hear you?
I don't know. Can you?
Yes, excellent. Okay, can everybody else hear him? Nod heads? Great. All right, Nate, what's up?
Yes, listen to my sultry voice as I speak. All right, what I liked most about it was the how they went through his life cycle as a newsreel, and then they told you the backstory as the story.
Okay. So, well, let's think about that for a minute. What does that newsreel do for you? What function does it serve?
So it sets up everything. It's a lot of exposition going on. It really tells the story without getting into the details. As they say, when they cut away from the newsreel to that newsroom,
Yep.
how they say it's hard to jam-pack a man's life into a newsreel.
Yeah, but they've tried to do it.
Yeah.
This is what I think is interesting about this, and maybe think about it this way, right? So what we have after the newsreel, right, is the reporter going around talking to people, and we get their perspectives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we see Charles Foster Kane from Leland's perspective, which is different than Susan's perspective, which is different than Bernstein's perspective, which is different than Raymond the Butler's perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the newsreel is another perspective, right? It's the public perspective. It's what everybody knows about this guy. So it's doing the same thing you're saying, right? It's setting everything up. It's giving us a framework. We kind of know where we're going. We have the beginning, middle, and end of this guy's life. And we as film viewers now kind of have the public perspective, right? What everyone knows about this guy. What we don't have yet is the sort of private perspectives, which is what we're going to get. Bob, got you there, Nate. What did you notice about the way that newsreel was, that section of the newsreel, that part of the film was put together?
Oh, it actually felt like a real newsreel.
Can you tell me why?
Details are escaping me at the moment.
Okay.
Like the way the guy was going through it, not really speed reading, but I mean, I know that was indicative of the time period.
Yeah. So the narration is not only is the narration of the right style.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, and I know we've got Professor Steve Jarrett in here somewhere from Wake Forest University who is liable to pop in and correct me on stuff when I make mistakes. I'm pretty certain that they actually used the guy who did the newsreels at RKO. So we talked about every studio had its own kind of newsreel unit that made newsreels for that particular studio. So this is a real guy. I do want to show you something. So this is another piece of an experiment. Stand by there for a second, Nate. I'm going to go to this. We're going to go to this. I want you to have a sense. By the way, this PowerPoint is on D2L now for those of you that want to look at it. I want you to have a sense of what these were like. So you can have a better sense of how well this recreates it. So this is from a stock footage. I used to be able to do that better. Come on. We're going to see the spinning ball a lot today, guys. I apologize for that. Okay. Those of you that know me may not be surprised. This is the longest PowerPoint that I have ever done. Okay. We're going to go to a stock footage company and look at a piece of one of these March of Times newsreels. So in Citizen Kane, it's called News on the March, which is okay, or maybe we're not. Hold on. Went through all that trouble for nothing.
Not like that's never happened before in this class.
No kidding. Nate, are you now seeing Chrome, the browser up there? Or are you still just seeing PowerPoint?
I got PowerPoint.
Okay, let me switch that. Let's do this. Let's do this. Where are you? It's just desktop. Okay. All right. Seeing the browser now, Nate?
Yeah, there it is.
All right. So if this works.
He is 85-year-old Sir Basil Zahara.
Well, we're getting audio.
Has been to foment war.
Here we go.
And supply all nations with weapons of destruction. He began life a poor Greek. He is ending it one of the richest men in the world. Powerful, mysterious, he drives away from his home at Monte Carlo. It is his secret where he is going.
Okay, so that's a pretty short clip. This is, we missed part of it. There we go.
Sir Basil Zahara. His job for 50 years has been to foment war and supply all nations with weapons of destruction. He began life a poor Greek. He is ending it one of the richest men in the world. Powerful, mysterious, he drives away from his home at Monte Carlo. It is his secret where he is going.
So this is a very small little clip. I want to show you a little bit more of a slightly long one. But you can already see there, right? You can see, you know, that the Citizen Kane News on the March seems to have almost pulled directly from this one, right? This one sort of biography about this particular public figure. You can hear, you know, you see the way the camera is kind of off to the side. It can't quite get access the way we see at the end of News on the March, where the camera's kind of outside the fences of Xanadu and looking over and looking down. You can hear that narration. You can hear that sort of style of writing. Another example of that. That's the actual one. Never mind. Hold on. I'm going to just show you a couple of minutes of an actual one from just a couple of years earlier, 1938, before we were involved in World War II, sort of documenting what it was like in Nazi Germany. And you can hear the whole spread of how this lays out.
The march of time. Show window of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany today is its capital city, Berlin. Here, the casual visitor may be surprised by the air of prosperity, the well-dressed crowd, and by the abundance of rich food served in its cafes and terraces. Nowhere does the visitor see privation or hunger. Berlin's parks and playgrounds are filled with groups of plain, cheerful people who show no signs of dissatisfaction with the fascist dictatorship which controls their lives. No apparent resentment against a government whose campaign of suppression and regimentation has shocked the world's democracy. Only those who get behind the scenes know that this outward cheerfulness is the creation of Adolf Hitler's fanatic little propaganda minister, Paul Joseph Goebbels. In the most concentrated propaganda campaign the world has ever known, Minister Goebbels has in 5 years of Nazi rule put 65 million people into a nation with one mind, one will, and one objective: expansion. Today, the Goebbels thunder is louder than ever before. For Germany is serving notice that all territory she lost in the World War must eventually be given back to her. First of all, the million square miles which once comprised her African empire. To fan the Nazi hatred of Russia, a Goebbels museum is filled with exhibits to show the horrors of communism.
Okay, so that gives you an idea. Nate, since I've got you unmuted and it's easier to talk to you than anybody else right now, so what are you seeing in that real newsreel of the March of Time that now kind of draws you back to the way in which they recreated it in News on the March? What else are you seeing?
Say the news articles and like the little. I don't recall if there was any of those maps in them March of the News?
There were, and if you'll recall, where they are is when Kane is first building his newspaper empire, and then his empire
That's right,
is
with the
collapsing.
radio. Yeah, with
Yep,
the radio
and you have
tower.
the little sort of kind of like the beginning of an RKO movie. You have the radio waves, like you say, kind of coming out, and yeah, so they did have that.
And like you said, the outsider's perspective of like a journalist trying to get almost like a paparazzi style videography.
Nice. Yep. Now
And
here's something.
Voiceover guy.
It is the same voiceover guy. Now here's something that's interesting about this, right? To me, well, it's interesting to me, so you got to listen to it. And Nate, let me. Since I'm going to mute you for now, so somebody else can get in. Okay, everybody still hear me? Nod heads. Okay. Wells came to Hollywood, and many of you are aware of this. Wells came to Hollywood on the strength of a radio drama that he had directed and produced. So, and we can get more in detail on Wells's background later. This is Wells's first feature film. Wells's background was as a theater director and as a director of radio dramas. And I think most of you are aware that during this period of time, radio, rather than being a place where you listen to music or listen to fanatical politicians, was a place where you would often listen to stories. You would have radio dramas. And the one thing that Wells did that got him so much notice is something many of you have heard of, which is an adaptation of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. I see you. I don't know if you guys can see Nate or not, but there's an adorable little creature behind him that snuck into the room. I'm probably going to have to give her credit. So the thing about War of the Worlds is Wells and his company took this story, that was at the time, 50 years old, updated it to modern times and told it as if it were a series of news interruptions on the radio, right? And one of the things that's sort of infamous about this particular radio broadcast is that it was done so well that supposedly lots of people believed it. Now the statistics on this are really in question. But one of the things that's not in question is if you go back and listen to War of the Worlds, you realize that Wells and his company were incredibly good at kind of drilling down to the tiniest little details that would help convince you, or maybe not convince you, but would help you establish a suspension of disbelief, would create verisimilitude, all these words that you got in your English classes. And that kind of same talent, I think, translates into this newsreel, where I don't think anybody walking into the theater, well, maybe some people did think they were seeing a real newsreel, but certainly for those people who are familiar with newsreels, they have a complete suspension of disbelief that this could be real, right? Everything about it. There are wonderful stories about Wells and his cinematographer, shooting footage and then taking it out into the parking lot of RKO and dragging the film around on the concrete of the parking lot to get it scratched up and beaten up so it looked like something that had been shot 30 years earlier. And that's just one of the many little tiny techniques that they use in the newsreel. And Wells had practiced on recreating news, radio news, when he did War of the Worlds. Okay, I'm looking at some notes over here. We don't have to worry about the audio. Well, so far, let's not get carried away. Let's see. Ethan has said, "Is Charles Foster Kane based off of William Hearst?" Okay, Ethan, do you want to talk about that? Should I unmute you? I'm going to unmute you anyway.
Okay. All
right, Ethan, you there? Hey, Ethan.
Yep. Hello.
That's an interesting question. And the answer to that is yes and no. And it's something that Wells himself has kind of gone back and forth on over went back and forth on over his lifetime in terms of admitting it or not. The reality of the situation is, and we'll get into who William Randolph Hearst is in just a second for everybody. The reality of the situation is the guy who wrote the first draft of this script, Herman J. Mankiewicz, was very familiar with William Randolph Hearst, who was himself a sort of giant newspaper tycoon during this era and during previous eras. Herman J. Mankiewicz knew him very well, had spent time at San Simeon, which was essentially his Xanadu. And we tend to think probably that first draft had a lot more to do with William Randolph Hearst maybe than subsequent drafts. As Wells did rewrites on the script, we can see that things come into the script that are more autobiographical for Wells. We can see things come into the script that seem to really sort of represent other tycoons of the era. But let me go back to the PowerPoint for a second, and let's talk just a little bit about who William Randolph Hearst was. Okay. So there's an interesting article here. I'll let you guys read yourselves about a screening a few years back of Citizen Kane at San Simeon, which was William Randolph Hearst's castle, which was rather ironic given the history. But this is what William Randolph Hearst's castle looked like. All right, this is in California. This is Xanadu. So I don't think there's much argument that can be made that Xanadu is essentially a copy of, a recreation of, even a parody of William Randolph Hearst's San Simeon, where William Randolph Hearst had enormous lavish parties that would go on for days, if not weeks at a time. This is William Randolph Hearst as a young man, as an older man. Once again, one of the most important things to know about William Randolph Hearst is that he ran a large syndicate of newspapers. And you know, there's an interesting parallel to be made here about William Randolph Hearst and something like Fox News. So there was a lot of sensationalist journalism from William Randolph Hearst. There was a lot of proponent journalism from William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst also had famously a mistress. Her name was Marion Davies. She was an actress. William Randolph Hearst never divorced his first wife, but he lived with Marion Davies at San Simeon. And Marion Davies' career is something that William Randolph Hearst was very interested in and used his power to kind of promote. We won't go through all of these. Well, maybe we will. I don't know. But if we want to draw parallels with William Randolph Hearst, William Randolph Hearst was a newspaper tycoon. So was Charles Foster Kane. At 23, William Randolph Hearst asked his father to let him run the San Francisco Examiner. And from that, he sort of built this empire. He used sensational stories and inflammatory editorial content designed to boost circulation. In one of those situations in Citizen Kane, where we know that we're obviously almost quoting an incident from William Randolph Hearst's life, for when America was about to engage in war in Cuba, William Randolph Hearst was famous in telling Frederick Remington, who was a very famous artist at the time, who had said, you know, I'm in Cuba, boss, there's no war here. William Randolph Hearst said, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. You may recall that, you know, William Randolph Hearst does in fact, that Charles Foster Kane does in fact say to a photographer, to a writer, you provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war. So that's obviously a reference here. William Randolph Hearst did launch failed bids to be the mayor and the governor of New York, so he did also try to be a politician like Charles Foster Kane. William Randolph Hearst began as a populist, kind of a left-winger, and ended up as a reactionary, kind of a right-winger. He did consort with fascists like Hitler, so we see Charles Foster Kane on a balcony at one point with Adolf Hitler. We've already talked about San Simeon Hearst Castle, and we've talked about Marion Davies. One of the things that's interesting to note, though, are the things that aren't the same. William Randolph Hearst was born rich. He was the pampered son of an adoring mother. That is not the story of Charles Foster Kane. When he met Marion Davies, she was already pretty famous. So it wasn't like he created her career from scratch. As we mentioned, he never married Davies, and he was twice elected to Congress. So he was a more successful politician than Charles Foster Kane had been. There are other moguls from this period of time with parallels. Other people who built opera houses for their wives and for their mistresses and things like that. Herman J. Mankiewicz, again, who co-wrote the script for Citizen Kane, was once a New York Times drama critic. There was a rich, wealthy, powerful man at the time called Samuel Insull, who had again built the Chicago Civic Opera House for his wife. Again, something we see Charles Foster Kane does. In an interesting story, Herman J. Mankiewicz got drunk one night, went to the newsroom, and passed out after writing the first sentence of a really negative review about Gladys Wallace, Samuel Insull's wife. We again see, so that's a story we see in Citizen Kane that is a recreation of a historical event but has nothing to do with William Randolph Hearst. The question becomes, and let me just get out of this for a second. The question becomes, does it matter? And the reason it matters historically is that the fact that people became convinced or figured out that Charles Foster Kane was based on William Randolph Hearst is something that enormously damaged the success of the film and enormously damaged Orson Welles' career. So when people working for William Randolph Hearst kind of started going, oh, we just heard about this movie Citizen Kane, or we just saw this movie Citizen Kane and it's about our boss and it's not very flattering, and Hearst newspapers, for example, which were all over the country, in fact, all over the world, would never run an advertisement for Citizen Kane. In a time when the only way you had any way of knowing what was on at the theater was by looking in a newspaper, that was devastating. There's even a point at which, and this would be an interesting alternative history to imagine. I think we've mentioned Louis B. Mayer, who was the guy who ran Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, which was probably the most popular, the most successful movie studio of this time. Louis B. Mayer got together with a group of other studio heads, and they went to RKO out of concern that this one movie, Citizen Kane, was going to anger William Randolph Hearst so much that he would come after, he would basically attack the movie industry. They went to RKO Studios and basically said, we will buy the negative of Citizen Kane from you. We'll buy it for what it cost you. We'll reimburse you for the cost of making this movie. You give us the negative, we're going to destroy it. It would have been a safe bet. It's a good business strategy, right? Okay, I want to make my money back. Maybe I just hand you the negative over. It's to RKO's credit that they didn't do that. But very briefly, the influence of William Randolph Hearst could very easily have robbed us of this particular movie. There is a historical reason why. I'm talking a lot now. Let me get to this end there. So you opened a kettle of fish there. There is a historical reason why the movie industry should have been afraid of William Randolph Hearst, because William Randolph Hearst was partially, if not largely, responsible for the backlash we've mentioned in the 1920s when there were all sorts of scandals. He sort of drummed up this fear of Hollywood movies and Hollywood personalities and the Hollywood lifestyle that did lead to the motion picture production code and the self-censorship of motion pictures. So they did have a reason to fear William Randolph Hearst. He had certainly had an enormous impact on their industry before. Okay, let me see where we are here. Did you want to add something to that?
No, I was just, my mom pointed it out when we were watching the movie. She's like, is this based off William Hurt? I'm like, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, if you knew who William Randolph Hearst was, that would actually be pretty impressive anyway. Okay, let's see where we are here. Okay, Ethan, I'm going to go ahead and go back and mute you again. Let me know if you want to come back. I can find you. Where are you? All right, I'll just mute everybody for a minute. Okay, let's see what we've got next here. From Logan, we've got, I really like how Wells did transitions in a lot of scenes. Okay, let me find you, Logan. Actually, can I click on this? Can I do this? Hold on, I'm looking for maybe a better way to do it, and I don't see it. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, Logan, you're unmuted. Are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear
So
me?
what about transitions did you find interesting? What transitions did you find interesting?
Well, I remember a few specific ones. At the beginning, whenever we're getting like the layout of Xanadu,
Mm-hmm.
it shows sort of like what it feels like because we get to see like the zoo that's out there and a bunch of the artwork and stuff. But as it transitions, Xanadu, like the actual palace, doesn't change positions in the background.
Yeah.
So it gives this sort of like mystic kind of weird. It's almost like I don't see the transition. I just notice new things whenever I continue to look at it because
Yeah.
objects take up the same space and they're like the same color and it's barely noticeable.
Yeah, let me. I've actually got a slide for that. Let me pull that up real quick. And if this is big enough for everyone to, well, it used to be that if I went here and went to view slideshow, it went to the regular slide. Yes. Okay. So one of the things you may notice here, because hopefully everybody can see it. One of the things you may notice as you look at this movie is that Wells has a tendency with every scene to start us outside and bring us in, which I think is, a way of him kind of telling the story about us, our perspective as outsiders being kind of brought into the inside story by all of these participants. So we start off, outside of Xanadu with this no trespassing sign, right? This is the first thing we see in the entire movie, which basically is kind of telling us, it's warning us, I think, that we may not be able to really figure this out. But one of the things that he's mentioning is if you look at the window, right, it's the brightest thing in every image. It's where we're going. It's where we're going to see Charles Foster Kane say Rosebud. It's where he's going to drop the snow globe. If you notice, as he mentions, it's in the exact same part of every frame. Even when it's reflected in the water, there at the bottom left, it's in the same, and I'm pointing to it like you can see me pointing. Well, you can probably see that right there. It's still in the same part of the frame. So we are moving through the series of dissolves. We're moving closer to our destination. But as he points out, the background is not changing that dramatically. It's just adding kind of foreground layers or peeling foreground layers back, perhaps.
We can't see the slides, Mr. Bowen.
I'm sorry?
We can't see the slides.
Oh, shoot. I need to share. I knew it. Okay, hold on. I know I was going to mess this up. All right, hold on. Let's just do desktop.
Hey, there it is.
There we go. Okay. I won't go through all that again, but again, you can see we start at no trespassing outside the fence. We dissolve to go inside, or actually it almost feels like we go over the fence in a weird sort of way. The window is in the same part of every frame. This is just a series of images from that opening sequence where we move closer and closer to the castle. Again, in the bottom left, you can see even in the reflection, the window's in the same place in the frame. So we're kind of peeling these layers off as we move closer and closer, and we're being carried through. This also, by the way, is a series of pretty impressive for the time special effects. We're looking at, with the shot with the monkeys, we're looking at a foreground piece that is full scale. We're looking at a gate in the background that is a miniature. We're looking at a castle that is a painting, right? And Citizen Kane is, we can get into that in more detail later if you guys want to. Citizen Kane is full of these kinds of special effects all over the place. So yeah, good point. Let me go back.
I thought it was interesting in a lot of other transitions, like fades and stuff. The fades were like really slow and they would stay like overlapped for a long time to sort of give that same effect where it's just moving rather than cutting to another scene.
Yeah, one of the most famous ones is when they're interviewing the elderly Jedediah Leland, and he seems to be like
that's the one I was
on the
thinking
roof,
of.
right? And that takes us into the breakfast table scene, and instead of it being just a dissolve, it's like the background goes out first, and the background is filled with the memory, and he remains in the foreground for a longer period of time. So instead of being a straight dissolve, it's some kind of weird sort of matte. I can actually show you guys that too real quick.
That's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, let me see. I think I've got that here somewhere. Well, now that I'm looking at it, maybe I don't have that. But hopefully you guys are remembering what we're talking about. If not, go back, take a shot at, look at that scene. Most any versions of the breakfast table scene will have those opening and closings, and you'll see that just a regular dissolve wasn't quite good enough. Yeah. Anything else on transitions that you noticed there?
A lot of them that like weren't fades, like what I was talking about, were just sort of like creative. Like I noticed two specifically. Whenever they first go to the Inquisitor, their like car moves in front of them, and it changes the angle of the camera when it does that.
Yep.
Then whenever they hire the like 9 greatest newspaper men,
right? Oh yeah.
Chronicles, it zooms in on the picture, and then that picture becomes like the next scene.
Yep.
And like the transition from that frame to them actually sitting there is like seamless. Because I saw like a few, like with the castle transition, when it faded, I could see just a little bit where the palace was just in a slightly different position and it faded over. But that one, it was just,
it's perfect. It's perfect.
I'm assuming they like took that frame and then made the picture with it and then put it in did the scene after it.
I would assume the same thing. It also reminds me of another transition that's very, very famous in this movie, which is when we go into the club to interview Susan Alexander Kane, and we start off on the roof of this building, and we kind of go through a sign and then go through a skylight and then come down into the set, which is several different shots, or at least 2 different shots. The building itself is a miniature. When it goes through the sign, as soon as the lens is kind of inside the sign breaks apart off frame, so the camera can keep moving forward. It goes to the window with the rain on it, and the rain sort of camouflages a dissolve to a high angle inside the club. When we're looking at the miniature, there's a projection inside the miniature of previously shot footage of Susan Alexander Kane, so it's like a back projection inside the miniature. This what we're at here right now, Logan, is I think it begins to nail down. And I know a lot of you need this explanation. I think this begins to nail down everyone's fascination with this movie, why this movie is so studied, why people keep saying it's the greatest movie ever made. And I think it is the density of it, right? You can zoom out and you can talk about the sort of political issues and societal issues and interpersonal issues that the movie is kind of addressing, or you can drill into these incredibly tiny details, because at every step of the way, Wells and his crew, the people who are working with him, are just throwing so much technique at us. And how different that is from something like Casablanca, where we don't sit back and talk about Casablanca and start talking about the transitions. You know, they're there, but they're not meant to draw attention to themselves in the way that this is kind of a self-conscious piece of art that allows us to, you know, spend 10 minutes talking about transitions, right? And I think that is part of what the attraction of this movie has been. Anything else about transitions, Logan?
No, that's it.
Okay, let's see. Braden says, I love the cinematography and lighting. It maximized the moods of the scene and directed our attention. So let me find Braden. Okay, Braden, you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Hey, so you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I was fascinated. One of the things that kind of surprised me is how many times like characters were just completely silhouetted out. They were just kind of blacked out. And one of the shots that comes to mind that was really stunning was when he goes in to read the manuscript, and there's just the beams of light coming down onto the manuscript, and all the characters are blocked out. And that was one of the things, like the newsman is blocked out. Like he's in shadow the entire film, and you never see him because it's like he's not important, and it's directing our attention. You know, the light like directs our attention. It's this manuscript, this epic manuscript that we're about to see, this fragment of this man's life, and we're going to go into that. And these other characters are not important. And there's other lighting things that he does with Kane, with, you know, having him like kind of half lit or having the light slashing his face, mood wise too, that maximizes that too. But I really thought how he just kind of blocked out the minor characters with the light and just silhouetted them sometimes.
Right. You know, there are a couple of things to mention. It's one of the things. You know, we live in this wonderful time in which all these old movies can be almost immaculately restored. But I think personally that Citizen Kane has been over restored. I think whoever has done the sort of restorations that we have a tendency to see now has brightened these images up more than they were intended to be brightened up. So if you go into right after the newsreel, and it's another great example of what you're talking about when we're in the sort of projection room, right? And all of the reporters and all the people who are producing the newsreel are sort of anonymous, and they're being backlit by these shafts of light. And, you know, the light of the projector is this physical thing. We can look at that, and we can look very carefully, and we can see people's faces. We can, if we look carefully, we can see Joseph Cotton, who plays Jedediah Leland, is sitting in that room. We can see that the guy who plays the first editor of the Inquirer that kind of gets dismissed, he's sitting in that room. I think we can see that Everett Sloan, who plays Bernstein, is sitting in that room. And I can tell you in versions that I saw years ago, you know, in movie theaters, you couldn't see that kind of detail. I remember the scene in which I think is a very telling scene, which we can get into, where Charles Foster Kane is reading his Declaration of Principles, and he goes into the shadow, that his face was completely in shadow in earlier versions. And, you know, I can't say for sure that this was intended, but I have this feeling that if you were in a theater in 1941 watching this movie, we're seeing a little more detail in the shadows. It would have been even a little more the contrast between the shadow and the light would have been even more extreme. I can't say that for sure, but there is a kind of consistent style throughout in terms of the lighting. Now, we want to give some credit not only to Wells, but also to, you know, and this is when you know you've been in the house too long and you're getting old. His cinematographer, a name that I know better than I know my own name, and which for some reason just right at this moment is not coming up. Let me share the screen here for a second. Greg Toland. Thank goodness I didn't have to look at it before I remembered it. We have to give some credit to Greg Toland too. So, you know, one of the things that's interesting to look at and is going to have some influence on what's coming up in later weeks in terms of lighting. You guys able to see the slides? I know it's probably a little small, but you can go pull this down off D2L later. Greg Toland, who was the cinematographer for Citizen Kane, who famously came to Wells and basically put his Academy, his Oscar, his Academy Award down on the table and said, "Mr. Wells, I want to work for you." And Wells said, why would you want to work for someone like me? I've never made a movie before. And he said, because you've never made a movie before, you don't know what can't be done. And that began a really astonishing relationship between these two men who had this common goal of making this movie that didn't feel like or didn't look like any other movies. We can look at earlier work from Greg Toland as we see some examples here from some movies like Dead End, Mad Love, Les Miserables, Kidnapped. And we can start to see some of these kind of the feeling of this lighting, this almost Baroque style of lighting with this high contrast. The image in the bottom right-hand corner here from Les Miserables, I mean, that lighting style could literally have been lifted right out of The Godfather, which was made 30 years later. Greg Toland did a lot of work with a director by the name of John Ford. Wells idolized John Ford. Some of you have probably already seen it, but the next movie we're going to be talking about is a film directed by John Ford called Stagecoach. Wells was often quoted as saying that in order to learn how to make a movie, he sat in a screening room and watched Stagecoach something like 40 times. Stagecoach did not have the cinematography of Greg Toland, but when Greg Toland worked with John Ford, it looked often like this. And if we look at the kind of lighting here, where Greg Toland in The Grapes of Wrath with John Ford is lighting things with candlelight, where we have this backlight and this fog and these shafts of light, we can see some of the origins of what we're going to see exaggerated into its ultimate extreme in Citizen Kane. So it's not that no movies ever looked like this before. It may be that Citizen Kane takes all these ideas and kind of puts them together in a package in a way that they had never been packaged before. But we've seen this before in the works of some of the people involved. We also have to think about Wells too. Although this is Wells' first movie, he was very famous as a theater director, and one of the things that many of his theater productions were famous for was the lighting style. And even in a few of these clips here from some of the shows that Wells did working with the federal government during the Depression, the federal government sort of provided funds for theater projects to be done so that the people who worked on Broadway and in the theater would have jobs, provide jobs for them. In some of these images from Julius Caesar and from what's referred to as the Voodoo Macbeth and Dr. Faustus, you can see, again, some of the origins of this kind of lighting, even in Wells's stage work. Any particular scenes that strike you? Let me stop this for a second. Any particular scenes that strike you in terms of? So you've mentioned the
the manuscript.
The manuscript. That's a really good example of that. I don't think I have a visual of that in the PowerPoint, but I think everybody will remember that scene pretty well.
Also the applause scene, which is that's kind of the manuscript scene is kind of the silhouetting is what I noticed that, but then the slashing of shadows, that he did this often. He did it on Kane in the applause scene when he's over applauding his second wife, and then also when his second wife leaves him and he's standing in the doorway, there's half of his head is slashed with shadows, and then he kind of walks into the light. Yeah. And there's kind of that implies that kind of duplicitous kind of nature that he's hidden, and that he's kind of backed away from us, and that we're kind of not seeing the full him ever, really, kind of.
Yeah. Let me, I think another really good example of that, we don't have to watch the scene, but let me just show you some clips from it real quick, is the Declaration of Principles scene. So hopefully you can see some of the images here. It does start outside the window. and he stages Kane so that he's writing on the window itself, so they're kind of turned towards us, and it does kind of move in, as so many scenes do. If we go from top to bottom first and then go from left to right, we can see he turns around and he's in this nice bright light. And he talks about the light. He talks about the fact that he wants the newspaper to be as important as the gas in this light, and he turns that light off, but he's still in the light. But as he begins to read the Declaration of Principles in the upper right-hand corner, he goes into shadow. Even when he's in shadow, people standing literally right beside him are in the light. You got any thoughts on why you would do that at that particular moment? I mean, it's one of those things that's very odd in this movie. It doesn't seem as odd to us because we see this all the time, but it was sort of axiomatic that the least thing you do as a cinematographer in a studio film from the 1940s is be sure the actors' faces are lit. So this does feel quite, I think, to an audience in 1941, this would be quite striking and quite strange. Do you have any thoughts about why that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I was saying, like I kind of read into it that it was that he's hidden away from us, that there's this duplicitous nature to him, and that I think when you're talking about like him signing these principles, it's like that's kind of the principles are really something that he's hiding behind, because one of the things that that creeps into the story that builds at the end is that everything he does is because he wants to be loved. And then all these things, him wanting to champion the working class, and him with his second wife and all this stuff, these are all just things to try to get people to love him. And so I think that maybe I'm reading too much, but the implication maybe here is that those principles is something he's hiding behind. He's not really being true to those,
And certainly, even if he's being true to them now, it's a warning that he may not be. And he obviously isn't. And we know what happens with these, right? They get sent back to him. Leland keeps them because he thinks they're going to be a great document, and they get sent back to him with a torn up check.
And he says they're a relic, or they're an antique. It's nothing but an antique or something.
Yeah. So this, might be a bit of foreshadowing in that way as well. In any other, let me stop that for a second. Any other, we could spend the entire semester talking about lighting in this particular movie. Are there any other scenes that really jump out at you that we should?
No, I mean, that was really, it was the second wife leaving him, and then the applause scene with I just remember the light slashing his faces, and now that you brought that one up, I do remember that him being blacked out, and just those times when somebody's face is blacked out, and it seems like there may be other times, but other characters are perfectly lit. And it seems to be for some purpose or some move to try to kind of imply some sort of duplicitous nature, or
and I think one other thing that's worth mentioning is the scene, and this happens more than once in the movie, but the scene in which Susan, she's sitting on the floor and he's standing, so he's already kind of looming over her. I believe it's the same scene where he gets the check from Leland and the Declaration of Principles. And she's kind of shrieking at him in this very shrill way that she's getting made fun of. She doesn't want to do this anymore. She doesn't want to be. And when he kind of puts his foot down and says, you're going to do what I say, he moves forward and casts his own shadow over her.
Yeah. That was an interesting, and it happens. Those kind of things happen so fast, and you pick up on then something. It moves on to some other interesting kind of lighting thing.
Well, and that might be, again, another reason why this movie is so popular with filmmakers and with film critics and with film historians and film theorists, is it is another, one of those movies, and we all know movies like this, that really rewards repeat viewings. There's so much there that you can keep watching it, and you can see something different every time you watch it. Okay, let's go to, let's see, Josh says, I'm going to go ahead and mute you back. Josh says, I liked how we were only fed more of Kane's life when the journalist interviewed a new person. It really tied the two storylines together. Let me find, I got people waiting to get in. I'm so sorry. Sorry for those of you that have been waiting to get in. I'm not paying enough attention to that. Looking for you, Josh. Hold on. Josh, you want to say anything more about that?
Also, we've watched several nonlinear storylines, and like with the one with Jim Carrey, it was like you had to really watch it again to get the storyline in sequential order. But here, there were two very distinct storylines that were linked together by this journalist. And you only got more of Kane's story when it was relevant to the other plot. And I really liked kind of how that you had two different storylines, but it still made it, you still understood what was happening when it was happening.
I mean, that's one of the things that it's for a non-linear story, it is strangely linear.
Mm-hmm.
In that, with a few minor exceptions, things like the breakfast table scene would be an exception to this. Even though we are moving from one character to another who's telling us their part of a story and giving us a kind of different perspective on what Kane was like, those pieces are still in chronological order, right? I mean, we start with Thatcher, and that tells us about his young life. We go to Bernstein, and that tells us about his young life as a journalist. We go to Leland, and that tells us about his sort of the beginning of his fall. We go to Susan, and so those bits are still kind of in a chronological order, which I do think makes it a lot easier to, especially for a 1941 audience to follow. You can imagine a version of Kane in which the first person you talk to is telling you what happened at the end of his life, and the second person they talk to is telling you something from the middle, and the third person is telling you something from the beginning, and how much more non-linear that would be. So, I think from a structural standpoint, it's very interesting that what they're basically doing with the different people who are telling us the bits of the story is not scrambling the timeline as much as it's giving us that when he was a young man, he was like this to this person, and when he was an old man, he was like this to this person, and that every distinct story seems to be telling us about a slightly different man, rather than just jumbling up the chronology for whatever reason. You want to follow up on that anymore?
That's nope. Just that was what I. That's
well, I do think, and this was mentioned earlier too. I do think, this structure where we have, we have Kane dying at the beginning in what is essentially a kind of objective sequence. We're kind of like a third party watching this thing, and we're allowed to see this thing, and then this newsreel that tells us the whole story, so that we don't have to worry about knowing what the story is. We've got, from 10 minutes into the movie, we know the whole story of the movie. And then you have these bits and pieces going through. And you're absolutely right in that it's two stories. There is, although we're not allowed to think of him as a character, the reporter, right? We're not allowed really to see his face. He doesn't become a character. We're not sympathizing with him. There is the story of his journey to try to uncover this secret. And when we're in these flashbacks from these different people's perspective, that's not what those people are focusing on. So there is like the two lines. There's the mystery of what is Rosebud, and there's the sort of putting and in what is a pretty obvious metaphor, putting together the puzzle pieces of Charles Foster Kane's. I don't think it's not terribly surprising that Susan ends up wanting to put together puzzles. That seems to make perfect sense in this movie. Okay, let's see. Delaney wants to talk about deep focus. Bless you, Delaney. Hold on, let me. Delaney, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, so what in the world is deep focus?
Yeah, so a lot of these shots you can obviously tell have so many layers, and they're used very intentionally. Like, of course, the famous one where it starts out with him in the snow and moves in to visibly show how isolated he is. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if this was really the first film that did that so well, or at all.
Okay, when you add so well, that makes a qualification. Is it the first movie to do this? No. So I want to share the screen for a second. Okay. Even if we go back to look at some of Greg Toland's earlier work with people like John Ford, you can begin to see in some of these images in particular, you can begin to see that, you know, maybe in this image, the third image in the left column, with the sailor standing on the ship, you can begin to see this sense of wide angle lenses and kind of deep focus. So the idea of this is, let's see, where do I have this stuff? Okay. So the idea of this is, number one, it's very difficult to pull this off, particularly in this period of time. For those of you who are more technically oriented, you will know that the way you increase your depth of field, or you make focus so that something in the far background is in focus and something in the foreground is in focus, there are two ways to do that. One is you use wide angle lenses, which also exaggerates depth. So, you know, if we're looking at little Charles Foster Kane through the window in the background, he seems a little further away. But you also do this by closing down the aperture, which is the little hole that allows more light or less light to get through the lens and onto the film. If you've got to close that little hole down, it means you've got to brighten up the set. So in order to get deep focus and to get images like this, which appear kind of dark, you know, and moody, they would have had to have pumped enormous amounts of light into these sets. And it doesn't appear that way, but that's the way it would have looked to the naked eye. They had to have special lenses created. That is something that Greg Tolan had been working on for years, to get sort of special lenses that would help this. Now the question becomes, and you've already addressed it to a certain extent, the question kind of becomes, why? Why go to all this trouble? And one of the reasons I think we can talk about takes us back to Wells as a theater director, who has a whole series of tools and a whole series of skills that he's developed that allow him to draw your attention to different parts of the stage. Right? So in movies, if we want you to look at somebody's face, we can cut to a close-up. On the theater, if we want you to pay attention to a certain person, there are tricks. You know, well, that person's talking, we look at them. Well, that person moves towards the camera, towards the audience, comes downstage. Well, we look at them. Well, that person is brighter lit than the other people. Well, we look at them. Well, that person's moving, everybody else is stationary. We look at them. So it allows Wells to do scenes like the ones we see here, largely without editing, right? So people in the background are in focus, people in the foreground are in focus. We can adjust our attention to one or the other. And we don't have to go in here and kind of force an audience's attention to look at this close-up or that close-up. It's all done with the movement of the actors and the staging of the images. And it allows these scenes to kind of play out. I want to take a minute. I want to show you guys something about this. This is not directly about Citizen Kane, but I think this is a really fun little interesting video essay about deep focus that I think explains the way this works a little, probably better than I am.
Andre Bazin said that deep focus shots evoke life better than shallow focus shots or montage because, one, they reproduce the sense of a coherent space that we have in real life, and two, because they allow us to direct our attention wherever we want the way we do in real life. Do you want to look at me? Or do you want to look at my girlfriend back there? You can choose. And the choice you make will be based on what you're thinking. Like, that girl is really cute, Is she really his girlfriend? Manny Farber saw it differently. He said that deep focus shots destroy space because they bring every detail to the surface, flattening the image. I don't know. She looks pretty far away to me. Does she look far in this shot?
It's your turn to be in the background. Really, my boyfriend. He's an idiot, actually. I would never go out with a guy like him. I'm an actor, looking for work in a real movie. This is the name and the email of my agent. Serious inquiries only. I don't do nudity. Well, maybe I would, just for you.
Anna. Anna.
Great. How did you, I wasn't paying attention. Did you take the cigar out really slowly?
He came over like before, and it was sort of like an anticipation.
Hold on, I'm trying to stop it. Okay, stop. There we go. So, the thing I like about that is it also gives you two sort of perspectives. There are literally people who decide to draw a line in the sand about, what's better, deep focus or cutting around inside a scene or intercutting. This was something that was relatively unusual, but again, not unheard of. And it's one of the things that we have to recognize about Citizen Kane is we're not going to go through Citizen Kane and find things that have never been done before. All this stuff had been done before. It probably never had been done to this level of density with all of these things kind of brought in at the same time in the same movie. I mean, very famously, people talk about Citizen Kane and you can see, they're low angles, so you can see ceilings in the sets. And, the idea that usually you didn't see ceilings in sets because they took the ceilings off the sets because they lit from up there, right? Mm-hmm. But you can find plenty of movies. You guys are going to watch Stagecoach if you haven't already, and you're going to see in Stagecoach there are low-angle shots in Stagecoach with ceilings on the set. So it's not like it's never been done before, but maybe not to this extreme and not this sort of densely. So when we talk about the deep focus, a lot of what people will focus, no pun intended, focus on is the way in which deep focus allows Wells to stage a scene with his actors in a different and unique kind of way. If we think about Casablanca, we don't see scenes in Casablanca like the scene that takes place in Charles Foster Kane's mother's house, right? Where we start at the window and the camera comes all the way back and we're seeing him outside in focus and we're seeing the strongest character in the scene, the mother in the foreground in focus, and we're seeing the second strongest person in the scene, Thatcher, in the midground, and we're seeing the weakest character in the scene kind of in the background, which is the father, and the way in which they move forward and backward as their relative sort of strengths in the scene. When the father starts to take control, he comes forward, and when she bats him down again, he moves back again. We don't see too many things like that in Casablanca. We see a lot of people sitting at a table and across from each other, and you cut to a close-up and you cut to a close-up, and there's no right or wrong here, but that's one of the things that people talk about most when they talk about this particular deep focus look. The fact that the deep focus is also accomplished by using wide-angle lenses, and that this movie is using wider lenses than most movies had used before, which means the background there's more background in the shot and things in the distance seem further away. Also gives it kind of a unique look. We don't see that kind of look in Casablanca either. It's more sort of normal, some mid-range lenses that kind of recreate the world in the way we tend to see it. What else about deep focus? Planning.
I mean, I know that was pretty much it. I think it's really interesting to view it in the lens of like stage blocking and be aware of his influence in that sense. So yeah.
Good. Okay. Comments are stacking up over here. Okay, I'm going to mute you. Thank you, Delaney. Let's see here. Okay, so Chase is asking, is this the first film to jump back and forth in time to tell a story? So let me find Chase here real quick. Okay, Chase, you there? Did Chase leave us? Chase, you there? Well, Chase appears to have gone. Okay, I'll answer his question though. And Chase, if you're there, send me another note real quick. No, it's not. And I think we've also mentioned that it doesn't do a lot of jumping back and forth in time. It's like it's a series of flashbacks. But there are some movies that have famously. I mean, you know, one of the greatest examples of this after D.W. Griffith made Birth of a Nation, the next film that he made is a film called Intolerance. It's another big, extravagant, much more bigger and more extravagant than Birth of a Nation was. And in Intolerance, he's got, I think it's 4 different stories, it might be 5, that take place in different eras of time. There's a contemporary story, and they're all about man's intolerance for his fellow man. And you know, there's one that takes place famously during Babylon, and there's one that takes place in France with the Huguenots. There's a contemporary story, and he is cutting back and forth between them. So if we start in, I don't remember how the order. If we sorry, who's on?
Can you hear me now? It's me, Chase.
Yes. Oh, Chase. Good. Okay. Good. Yeah.
Microphone went wacko there, and I couldn't hear or talk to you.
Okay. So what I was answering your question by basically saying no, it's not the first film, and I was coming up with the example of D.W. Griffith, the follow-up he did to Birth of a Nation called Intolerance, which has 4 or 5 different stories that take place in 4 or 5 different periods of history. And he's literally cutting back and forth between those stories, and each one is kind of commenting on the other. And they're all about, you know, man's intolerance for man. Very famously, there's a movie from the mid or early 1930s called The Power and the Glory, which has a very similar sort of structure to Citizen Kane, in which we're telling the story of, in this case, if I remember correctly, it's another rich guy. It's a railroad tycoon in this case, if I remember correctly, and it's telling his story after he has died by going back and forth to a bunch of his friends and acquaintances and having them tell stories about him. So this is certainly not the first time this has happened. We can't describe, you know, even in Casablanca, you got a flashback, right? So I think, once again, Kane is doing it to an extent that few movies had done it before. But it's certainly not the first time.
Okay.
Any you want to follow up on that at all? Or
no, that's it. That's just all I wanted to know.
Okay. So Earl was letting me know we couldn't see the slide. Thank you, Earl. We cannot see the slides, can't see the PowerPoint, can't see the screen. Thank you, guys. If I could have seen your notes, I would have known sooner. Okay, Jack. I love that you brought this up, Jack. Let me find you. So I'm unmuting you, Jack. Jack has written, the transition of the bird screaming as his wife left terrified me. Okay, so hold on. Let me go back. Hold on a second. Let me mute everybody else here, and let me go back and unmute Jack. Are you there, Jack?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah,
go ahead. Talk about it.
There's not a whole lot for me to say about that, just that it came out of nowhere and I had kind of zoned out a little bit, and it really just snapped me back, and I had to rewind to see it again. I just didn't see it coming at all.
Yeah, and if you look at it, technically it's very kind of poorly done. You can see through the bird's eyes. You know, it's not the best special effect in the movie. I've actually been thinking about this particular scene a lot recently. Yes, that's what my life is like. I'm sorry. I've been thinking about the bird in Citizen Kane a lot recently. You know, we go to see horror films now, and horror films are often judged, right, on jump scares, right? Are the jump scares earned? Are the jump scares, do they work? Is it just somebody throwing a cat at the screen, which seems to be the thing nobody likes? And a lot of the times those jump scares are basically to kind of, to give you a little bit of tension, to kind of wake you up a little bit, to kind of make the world of the film seem a little more dangerous. And I personally, this obviously looks like this bird idea was something that was put in as an afterthought. And if anybody knows any detail about this that I don't know, please feel free to chime in. My feeling is that as they watch this movie and as you get into the story of Kane and as Kane's world sort of closes in and he gets old and he loses energy and they're sort of ensconced in this Baroque sort of palace, and it's dark. I honestly think that this is Wells going, we need something to wake you up, just like the exact same effect it had on you. I think that's the reason it's there. It's there to basically say there's emotional violence happening here, so we want to poke at you a little bit. Don't be complacent, I think that's literally, I suspect they're watching this movie and going, wow, it's getting really slow right now. Let's have a bird screech. I honestly think that's probably the case. But I'm glad it had that effect on you, because I think that is the effect it's supposed to have. And it is like, when I talk about horror films, one of the things I like to say is the thing that we are scared of when we watch horror movies is not the killer or the murderer or the ghost or the demon. It's the filmmaker. It's what's this filmmaker going to show me? What's this filmmaker going to do to these characters? And you get into something like Psycho and you see a main character killed, a half an hour into the movie incredibly violently. And you basically, what that does to you is, I don't know what this Alfred Hitchcock guy is going to do. And I think we have that same kind of moment there where, oh, I've got to pay attention here because something really weird might happen. And I do think, as you kind of mentioned, it does kind of parallel the emotional violence that's going on, even though it's kind of a quiet emotional violence in a way. Do you have any other thoughts about that? Did you have any other thoughts about that?
Not regularly.
Okay, all right. Camden does going to say, I don't understand what the bird screaming was about. Shook me to my core, LOL. So Camden does also, I think. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody again. Okay, let me find Odin. Hi, Odin, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Odin says, I liked you guys can probably read this, but I don't know I like the difference in testimonies, especially for Thatcher's, because it was his memoirs that were read rather than it being an interview. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
Basically, like, compared to like all the other like kind of flashbacks, it was all like interviews, like with his ex-wife and with his other friends, versus with Thatcher's. Like, he was his guardian, and what he was reading just his like memoirs that were in the bank, and I thought that was a different like just hearing a person's word, versus like what they've actually written down.
Well, it also kind of allows us to get testimony from the grave, right? It allows us to for people who might not still be around. It allows us to get that part of his life. It's an incredibly important part of his life too. We have to have that information. But Rosebud doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense if we don't have that piece of information. I'm hoping most of you notice that when Thatcher goes to take little Charlie away, that Charlie hits him with the sled. The one thing that Charlie has to sort of fight back against this oppressor as a weapon is this sled. And I think that's an incredibly important moment. And we certainly don't want to lose that because a character maybe is at the time dead, right? And I think you're also right. It just mixes it up a little bit. It makes things a little bit different. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, Odin?
No, pretty much got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see. We've just got a couple minutes left. Dylan says, I found Kane's declaration of principles when he starts and his news career reflects his mindset and the mindset of big business in life and film. That's a good one. Let's end with that, Dylan. Hold on, let me find you. Dylan, you there?
I'm here.
Yeah, do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, like, so usually when you see somebody that's in business or, you know, like they have the money and whatnot in a film, there's a gradual decline into doing things immoral. With him, it was like almost instant. Like, it's like, okay, we're going to do this right. We're going to do this right. We're going to be truth. And then there's yellow journalism. There's, you know, inflammation of stories, you know, and it's not gradual at all. It's just like, it hits you in the face. And I never see a scene really where he feels bad about it. Like, he's, you know, he's okay with this. You know, he wants to be loved. We mentioned that earlier, but he's okay with all this extra stuff that he does to get these reactions, to do these things, even with his ex-wife, you know, forcing her into things. As long as it pushes the limit, and even with his thing with Thatcher, as long as it messes him up, he's okay with doing these things. There's no regret. There's no regret. And you see that a lot of movies with business or with tycoons. Sometimes there's regret at the end. They wonder what they've done to themselves. But with Kane, it was just kind of like, this is par for the course. This is what I'm going to do, and I don't feel bad about it.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's interesting to you know, to kind of go through step by step and realize, or at least examine what Kane's motivations are at any particular given moment. I mean, and there are points in which he'll tell us things. You know, he'll say things to Thatcher. Thatcher will say something like, "What did you want to be?" And he will say something like, "Everything you hate." I mean, his hatred for Thatcher does seem to drive him enormously. And then later, his need to be loved. You know, I look at the scene with the Declaration of Principles, and I think at this point in time, he might believe that. You know, to some extent, he might believe that. But you still have to deal with the motivation of, okay, if that's what you're going to do, why do you have to declare it, right? That does seem to be, by design, that seems to be some kind of plan. But this is, you know, this is about theoretically, this is about a guy's downfall. And I'm thinking about what you're saying now, because it's giving me a slightly different perspective on the film. This idea that his downfall is really kind of sudden in a way, because almost from day one in that newspaper, he's doing. You know, I think one of the things that's interesting is that when he is young, and he is doing things like starting wars, you know. Mostly, I think, because that would be something that Thatcher and his guys, you know, or he's attacking Thatcher and Thatcher's sort of cronies. He's never doing it out of any kind of purity of intention. He's always doing it out of one of these burrs that he's got stuck in his skin. Whether it's the Thatcher burr or the, you know, I was never loved as a child, or, you know, any of these kinds of things, which obviously all lead to Rosebud. That's interesting.
So just like lots of resentment, huh? Just like lots of resentment and pain. So you strike out and you react in ways that, you know, mess people up. So.
And and it is part of his character that he really never admits that he's wrong, and he never really is. We never see that he is in any way sad or regretful about what he's done. I mean, to me, and I know we're out of time, to me, one of the most important scenes in the film is the confrontation between Kane and Leland after he loses the election, where Leland is really kind of calling him out on, you know, all you ever wanted to be was loved, and you'd do anything to get it, and these people don't really need you. And the way that scene is staged, and the way in which Leland is constantly kind of moving forward in a confrontation, and Kane will kind of fight back, but then Kane turns away because you know, he's being stung and he's not winning, and the way it's kind of attack and retreat. And the way that scene is filmed, right, from these incredible low angles where they literally had to go in and dig a hole in the floor of the studio in order to get the camera as low as Wells wanted it to be. So that these characters are not just two characters, but they're these larger than life ideas that are kind of hovering over us. I think is all very important. Well, I think that brings us to the end. I'll save these comments because we will continue to talk about this on Thursday. I appreciate everybody showing up. I hope everybody's well. Feel free to email me if you've got any issues or problems or things are going on. That was a great conversation as usual. You're turning into my favorite class, guys. Keep it up. And do be well and be safe. And we'll do this again same time on Thursday. Is that all right? I can't hear anybody because they're not all muted. I'm going to unmute everybody. There we go. We're all out.
Hi.
Yay.
Question.
Hey, what's
All
going
right.
on?
All right. Thank you, guys. I'll see you on Thursday.
Howdy, chill.
All right.
Have a good day.
Peace. Good. Yeah.
Have a good day.
Is there one of these for single cam after this or no?
No, there's not. I think
Okay.
we may do a single cam one maybe next week just to answer some questions and stuff. But hopefully that enormous document I sent up for single cam will answer everyone's questions. But yeah, I'm thinking maybe next week we'll have a little session just people can join in and ask questions or whatever.
Because I'm not getting any emails from you at all. I've sent you an email about that. I've not gotten a single one.
Ooh. Okay.
So,
I mean,
I'm about to call IT and figure out what's
I
going on.
wasn't able to get one for this either. I had to get the link sent to me.
Really?
The email's correct in the email
Yeah.
that I got linked. I don't know what's wrong, but
In the email list, it shows my email, but I didn't get it for some reason.
Okay, so that's probably not something on my end, but what I will do, I've been sending stuff out from a new email address because my MTSU email is just a disaster, and I want to focus on the students. So I've got one email that's just for you guys, but there may be an issue with that. So I will go back and send everything again through my MTSU email, and I will send it from both emails from now on, and we'll see if that solves the problem. Okay. So Josh, I'll be sending that out in just a little while. Just keep an eye and see if you get something in. If it comes from my MTSU and it doesn't come from Gmail, we'll know that that's what the problem is.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Thanks, guys. Hey, Steve. Steve, stay there, and let's have another meeting, just you and me, real quick.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to end this one, guys. Thank you,
Professor
again.
Bowen. I got a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've tried to send you a couple emails which may went to your MTSU email about getting permission to take advanced film seminar this next semester. And which email should I send it to?
I will go look for it, so don't worry about it. I'll go find it.
Okay. Appreciate it.
All right. Is registration happening now?
Yes, they did Skype calls over spring break. And we should be registering. I got an email yesterday. April 6th is when it opens up.
Okay. Actually, who's talking to me right now? I can't tell.
Austin Sism.
Oh, okay, Austin. I'll go look for your email.
Okay. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Hey, I do have a question, sir.
Go ahead.
All right. So I finished that take-home exam with the Scantron.
Yes.
And I did write my for my 10 possible extra credit. I sent that to your email.
Okay.
There's no other way I could possibly send that to you. Is there any way you would like that so I can
No,
try to get credit back?
if you send it to my email, I will have it, and in the next day or so, I will get through my MTSU email as well. So
I don't want to overwhelm you.
No, give me a couple of days. What I will always do when I get something from you is I will send you a quick email back that just says "got it."
Okay.
So give me a couple of days, and if you then do not have that email back from me, let me know, and we'll revisit it. But I'm sure it's just in there, and I just haven't gotten to it yet.
Yeah, I was just making sure because it's like if you can't see what I bubbled in, just email me back, and I'll try to take a different picture of it.
Okay.
Because my lighting's a little off, so.
All right, will do.
When should we expect the grades back on D2L?
I do not know yet. I need to get into that and see. So I'm trying to give people a little bit more time to input that stuff into D2L. Let me see if I can get it done by see where we are on Thursday. Okay. Okay. Now, Braden, you've been anxiously sitting there waiting.
Well,
So
that was maybe I missed it in one of your emails. It was about the take-home test. Is there? How do we submit that? Do we?
Well, what I'm asking everyone to do, and I know this is extra work for you, but believe me, it was also extra work for me. Since I really can't get those Scantrons from you, is in D2L under quizzes is the midterm exam. If you can go into D2L and just kind of take the answers that you put on the Scantron and move them into D2L, just answer every question, then it can be graded that way, and that's the easiest way. If that doesn't work, you can scan your Scantron and send it to me, and I'll do it myself. But if
would you prefer me to do that?
Yeah, and the quizzes are also on D2L as well. So you've got the quizzes for like Citizen Kane, Stagecoach, that kind of thing. You got 10 minutes to take them. So once you start, and the image files for those quizzes are in the content section. Yeah, all that is in that document too, hopefully, for those of you that got it. Okay.